Welcome to session 9, part C. I'm going to start off. We talked about part B, the notion of a price ceiling. Uh, the book talked a little bit more about another type of price ceiling, and that's rent control. Um, Now, I want to discuss a big notion that this textbook emphasizes. I think probably lots more than other textbooks do for intro econ class, and that's the unintended consequences. And um, understanding it's almost more an art than a science. I think it's just a way economists think, and I think uh, the way lay people don't think. They don't think about unintended consequences. And I think the average layperson says, well, you make some policy change, like you make some mandate that all uh, rents in a certain town, the rents that landlords charge must go down 10%. And I think the average layperson tends to assume in their mind or imagine that everything else will stay the same. Like everyone keeps their current apartment, the supply apartments that doesn't change, no other behavior changed, and the only thing that happens is that everyone who currently has an apartment magically pays 10% less. Okay. Um, Now, an economist thinks, no, 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 let's think about how the market would respond, how other people would respond to that policy change, and how everything else held constant is not true. Okay. So, the first thing, what I want to do is just do some little demand and supply analysis. And this is, let's go back. Say we have some particular apartment in some city, some particular quality of apartment, a one bedroom, and this area that make the types somewhat homogeneous. So we're looking at a particular type, and there's a demand for these types of apartments. There's a supply, the current price, the rent. It's somewhere like there. And then there's a new policy that says we have rent control, that all of a sudden the new rent is 10% less, so P prime. And this is the price ceiling. So the only prices allowed are below that line. Um, what would happen with such a ceiling? Well, the actual price would be P prime. The new quantity demanded would be here. The quantity supplied would be here. Now, one thing actually we didn't talk about in part B, if you make the price ceiling above the market clearing price, so let's say the current for this brand of apartment, the rent was $1,000 a month, and you made the price ceiling 1,200 a month. So you can't charge above 1,200. Well, that wouldn't affect the market at all. All the landlords say, well, okay, fine. I'm already 1,000. Yeah, okay, I'll stay below 1,200. It won't affect my price. Okay, so that would be if we put a price ceiling above that market clearing price. Okay, that makes a good test question. Um, but what happens if the price ceiling is below the market clearing price? What happens? Okay. Um, the first thing is we like to think that, um, as I said, all that happens is that the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied say the same, where that won't happen at all. At least if we have upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curves. All of a sudden, before this was the market clearing quantity, now there's going to be more people who want an apartment than before. And there's also going to be fewer apartments. There's going to be there's going to be landlords who are going to say, well, if I can't charge that old price, I'm just going to take mine off the market. I'll let my nephew live there for free or something. So all of a sudden, that's an unintended consequence. One is that there are fewer apartments available. Second one is there's actually going to be more people demanding apartments than before. Okay. So, and then on top of that, okay, or related, is that we're going to have an excess demand. And another word for it is shortage. Okay. Now, one thing that happens in such a situation when you have an excess demand, you're going to basically have queuing. How are you going to fill up how are you going to decide who wants? There's more people who want these apartments than there are apartments. How do you decide that? Well, more people are going to show up trying to get the apartment than there are apartments. All of a sudden, landlords are going to be able to be more selective. They're going to start using other criteria besides price. And they may do things like, I'm going to pick the handsomest people. They may do something like race. There can be some bad things that happen when you have these when you have excess demand. So that's an unintended consequence of a price ceiling. Another thing is that renters will change their behavior. Before, you would just show up, apply for an apartment, pay whatever the equilibrium price or the market clearing price. Now that's not going to happen. Renters going to have to do things like wait in line, or as the book said, they're going to have to do things like search the obituaries in the newspaper to see when an apartment might open up. It's going to change the behavior of the people wanting to rent. And then another thing that one final unintended consequence that the book discusses is that the quality will decrease. So if you're a landlord, before you were having to charge a market clearing price, you didn't have excess customers, you didn't have people waiting in line. Now you do. All of a sudden, you don't have to upkeep the apartment as well. The quality of the things like repairs, paint, keeping the apartment new looking, you don't have to do that as you would have to do before if you're the landlord. So that's another unintended consequence, and that's widespread. Once people have lived in a place that has rent control, they all learn that all of a sudden the quality of the apartments starts going down. So those are a few of the unintended consequences that economists think of, and hopefully you will after taking an economics class. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about. There's a section on rent control. I wanted to make one other little thing. So another unintended consequence, almost of anything, when you make something illegal. The book discussed this. All of a sudden, black markets will arise. Okay, that's a common unintended consequence. The book says that when you make something illegal, it makes supply more inelastic. And I'm not sure that's true. Whatever the case, there's no chance a question like that would be on the exam, because I think I may disagree with the authors. So when it says that the supply, so you make something illegal, well, okay, yeah, the supply will shift in. People start supplying less of that. The elasticity says something about the slope of that supply curve, and I'm not exactly sure why the slope would change, why it just wouldn't be a constant shift. So I think I probably disagree with the authors on that, so don't worry about that if you couldn't understand it. The book also said if you make something illegal, the main effect is on the suppliers, not the demanders. That also I don't see. I'm not sure I agree with the authors on that. The only thing I could think of would be something like abortion law. So the pro-life people say, most of them, when they say they want to make abortion illegal, we thought, well, what's the penalty going to be? And often I think to make their position more politically attractive, they say, well, we're not going to punish the mothers, the women having the abortion. We're only going to punish the doctors. Well, if that's true, the doctors are the suppliers of abortion in this case. The women, the mothers, would be the demanders. And so if you made it that way, I think the authors of the textbook are right that it would reflect this law would affect the suppliers more than the demanders. But on the other hand, I don't see it in other aspects. So when prohibition existed, all of a sudden it was illegal to sell, I think also to buy alcohol. So you could get put in jail if you bought alcohol, not just if you sold it. I think the same thing with drugs. Now, maybe the you could argue that the penalties are stiffer on the drug sellers, the suppliers, and the buyers. Maybe abortion, not abortion, prostitution. So, yeah, if you practice prostitution, the prostitute can go to jail. But I think the term is called the John, the person who is buying the prostitution also can go to jail. So in those cases, it would affect when you make something illegal that affects the suppliers and the demanders. So I'm not exactly sure I understand what the authors were saying when they said that. So don't worry. I'm not. That would not be a question on the exam if you didn't understand that in the book. Okay. So far, we've talked. So I wanted to show something about demand and supply curves, and we talked about what happens when there's a price ceiling. Okay, the opposite can happen. There's a price floor, so you cannot charge below a certain price. What's an example of this? The book discusses one example is agricultural price supports. So sometimes the Department of Agriculture in the U.S. trying to protect farmers, they will say there's too much unhealthy competition among farmers, and they compete against each other so much, and it causes prices to go down, and it puts farmers out of business. So to prevent that, the government can get involved and put a price floor. And that said, for if you sell corn, you cannot sell corn below this certain price. Excuse me, yeah, you cannot sell below this certain price. So they talk about price support. So that's one example of a price floor. The biggest example of a price floor, though, is minimum wage. Okay, so in that case, so now I think it's 2020. I think it's 7.25 is the current minimum wage. Here, let's do an economic analysis of what happens when you have a price floor, such as the minimum wage. Okay. So usually when we talk about the minimum wage, we'll talk about the supply of unskilled labor and the demand for unskilled labor. So that's what we're thinking of here. And if the market clearing price, say here, the market clearing quantity would be here. And then suppose that in the U.S. it were $6 an hour. So this P is $6 an hour, but then the government imposes a price floor, say $7.25. What would happen? Okay. So actually, by the way, I think in most cities, most urban areas in the U.S., that 7.25 is actually the market clearing price is something like $10. So I think, for instance, 2020 in Fairfax, Virginia, if you do any kind of unskilled labor, say you're a cook at Burger King, you're a janitor, something that does not involve that much training, a job that you could learn in 1 to 2 weeks. You don't even need a high school education. I think your wage is well above $7.25 an hour. It's something like $8 or $9 or $10. If so, what that says is that price. So when we say a price floor, it means that the price can only be above that line. Okay, but if that price floor was below the market clearing price, it would have no effect. So if if this is 7.25 and that market clearing price is $9 an hour, the 7.25 doesn't have an effect. But if we're in an area, say we're in rural Arkansas, where unskilled labor, the market clearing price is something like $6 an hour, say, that 7.25 would have an effect. What would happen? Well, at this price, the market doesn't clear. Instead, this many people are willing to supply their labor, and this many businesses demand the labor. So the amount of labor supplied is that much, the amount of labor demanded is this much. The difference is in excess, that amount is excess supply. Okay, and for the labor market, another word for excess supply is just unemployment. Okay. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about, so that is the amount of unemployment. Okay. Most economists will say that if you put um, uh, uh, if you put a minimum wage, okay, you make it increase above the market clearing price, then that will cause um, the amount of employment demanded to decrease. That means the number of jobs. So what this would happen, this is the old amount of jobs, this is the amount of workers, and they equal each other. Well, all of a sudden you put the minimum wage, the number of jobs will go down by this much, but the number of workers wanting jobs will go up by that much, and the sum of that will be the unemployment. Okay, a kind of controversial question. This is, will the number of jobs really go down if that happens? Okay, some have argued that maybe not. And let's see if I can do this. I'm going to use a red marker. And here's what happens. If instead the demand curve for jobs, so the demand for labor, this is the number of employers that want to hire people. Instead, the demand curve looked like this. So we call that completely inelastic. So it's just a fixed number. If I've made it perfectly vertical, that would mean it's a fixed number, and if they'd be willing to pay any price to get that amount of labor. If that happens, when we put the new minimum wage, what happens to the number of jobs? Well, QD becomes this amount. And if instead, if I'd made that red demand curve perfectly vertical, then that QD would just equal the old Q. So the number of QD is the number of jobs available. If I made it perfectly vertical, it would be exactly the same as before. So if you're willing to believe that demand curves are perfectly inelastic, that demand curves are vertical, demand curves for unskilled labor, then a minimum wage actually does not decrease the number of jobs. Now, I don't think anyone really believes that it's perfectly inelastic, but if, that's an empirical question whether it's true or not, and if it were, you could make that argument. But even if so, even if the demand curve were perfectly inelastic, which I think is an unreasonable assumption, you'd still have unemployment with the minimum wage increase, or with the minimum wage. And the reason why is because if the supply curve is sloping upward, you would with the new minimum wage, you would have more people wanting to work at that wage. The quantity supplied before it was Q and now it's going to be QS. So now you would have more laborers entering the workforce, but they couldn't get a job. The quantity demanded is the same as before, and that would be the unemployment. Okay, even though the number of jobs might have stayed the same. Okay. Um, so, okay. Now, on the other hand, you could have also said, what if the supply of labor is also completely vertical? If that's true, okay, I don't think many economists at all think that the supply of labor is perfectly vertical. That would say that um, for even a huge increase in the wage, you're not willing to work more. Okay. But if that were true, people just had a fixed amount of time they were willing to work, no matter what the wage, that would give you a perfectly vertical supply curve. If so, you would get that case that unemployment would be essentially zero if you had a minimum wage increase. Okay. Um, okay. Okay, I think that's where I'm going to end. Okay, talk about the minimum wage. Uh, just the final, real quick point, as the book talked about. Um, no, wait, no, let's see. I'm going to talk about one final point. Um, about minimum wage. No, actually, I'm gonna save it for part D. So, okay, so that is minimum wage. By the way, this analysis works. Same analysis works for any kind of price floor. Okay, but the most common price floor would be the minimum wage. Okay, so that's the most important part for this analysis of minimum wage. Okay, that's part C. See you in part D.